Hello, friends. Welcome to Soft History Stories. In the Middle Ages, every sound meant something. The clang of a hammer, the toll of a bell, the crackle of a hearth each carried its own command. It was a world that breathed in rhythm with its rules. Even the wind that sighed through the thatched roofs seemed to whisper reminders. When to pray, when to work, when to stop living loudly. Every act from the bread you baked to the cloth you wore was watched, judged, and bound by law. Even breathing after sunset, it seemed, had to be done carefully. Picture, if you will, a small village at dusk. The air is thick with smoke and the faint smell of manure and rye bread. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolls slow, heavy, deliberate, a signal that the day has ended and obedience must begin. Fires are doused, curtains are drawn. The faint laughter of children fades beneath the hum of insects and the rustle of hay. Across the fields, a few last shapes hurry home before darkness fully claims the roads. There are no street lamps here, no comfort in the dark, only the knowledge that rules, like God's, must be obeyed. For this was not a time ruled by freedom, but by fear, disguised as order. The Middle Ages were governed not only by kings and priests, but by laws so specific, so strange, that they bordered on poetry. Rules for how to dress, how to eat, how to bury the dead, even how to think about the sky. Many of these regulations seem absurd to us now, relics of superstition and control, but back then they made perfect sense. In a world without science, rules were the fragile walls that kept chaos at bay. If God didn't explain everything, perhaps a curfew bell or a fasting order would. Every restriction was a prayer for safety, every punishment a warning against the collapse of order. To live in the medieval world was to carry the weight of invisible commandments. Don't wear silk if you are poor. Don't light a candle after the bell. Don't eat meat on Fridays. Don't laugh too loudly, or walk too freely, or die without permission. For every act, there was a decree. For every soul, a boundary. Yet within this strange web of laws, people still found rhythm and reason. They believed that these rules, however harsh, protected them from sin, from sickness, from the unknown that howled beyond the firelight. And so tonight, as you lie back and let the noise of the modern world fade, we'll wander together through that curious landscape of obedience, the rulebook of survival, where superstition met necessity and faith met filth. We'll see why peasants couldn't wear purple, why bells told people when to sleep, and why bathing too often might make you a heretic. It was a world where madness looked like order, and order like devotion, where every absurd rule existed for a reason, even if that reason was fear. So, close your eyes. Let the sound of the bell fade into the distance. The fire is low. The air smells faintly of bread and smoke. And we are stepping back into the Middle Ages, a place where life was fragile, faith was law, and the wrong color of your tunic could ruin your life. And if you enjoy drifting through the quiet corners of history, remember to like, share, and subscribe to Soft History Stories, where the past whispers you to sleep, one strange law at a time. The first rule of the medieval world was simple. You were what you wore and what you were allowed to wear. Appearance was not just vanity, it was obedience made visible. The church preached humility, the nobles demanded respect, and the law, the Sumptuary law, decided which fabric your soul could afford. The body became a walking proclamation of status, and society itself was a theater of cloth and color. From the moment a child was born, the thread of their destiny was already spun. A peasant's skin would itch with rough wool. A merchant's fingers would smell faintly of dyed linen. A noble's robes would trail behind them like small declarations of divine favor. The hierarchy was woven into every stitch. For the poor, clothing was not expression but survival. It had to endure mud, weather, and work. For the rich, it was a costume of holiness and superiority. as though fine silk might hide sin better than coarse wool ever could. The laws were very clear and very cruel in their elegance. In England, Italy, and France alike, royal decrees listed precisely who could wear what. Commoners could wear brown or gray, the colors of dust and toil. Velvet and silk were reserved for those of noble birth. Gold embroidery was the privilege of lords and bishops. Fur belonged to those whose wealth could buy warmth and morality in the same breath. And purple, that regal color of emperors, was a forbidden dream for almost everyone. It wasn't merely a fashion choice, it was a moral offense. To wear purple without permission was to challenge the divine order itself. Some who dared were paraded through the streets in mockery. Others found themselves fined, imprisoned, or stripped not of their garments, but of their dignity. It seems absurd to us now punishing someone for a color, for a texture, for the mere courage to look wealthier than they were. Yet to the medieval mind, the logic was airtight. In a world ruled by appearances, imitation was rebellion. A merchant dressed like a lord could unsettle the very balance of heaven and earth. If everyone looked equal, who would know who was chosen by God? The clothes maintained the illusion that society was not only structured by man, but sanctified by heaven. The sumptuary laws were not just fashion regulations, they were theology stitched into the seams. Even the smallest details carried weight. The width of a sleeve, the length of a cloak, the trim on a shoe, all were dictated by law. In Florence, a tailor could be fined for adding an inch too much fabric to a merchant's coat. In France, a wife's headdress was regulated by her husband's income. And in England, where wool was the pride of the realm, even peasants were commanded to wear it not because it was comfortable, but because it displayed loyalty to both economy and God. Beauty itself was rationed, carefully measured like flour or salt. But beneath the surface of these rules, something else simmered: resentment, pride, and a strange kind of defiance. The human heart has never taken kindly to being told what not to wear. Across Europe, there were always those who tested the edges of the law. A farmer might line his cloak with rabbit fur, pretending it was the pelt of something rarer. A merchant's wife might stitch a thin ribbon of imported silk into her hem, too small to notice unless one looked closely. A butcher's daughter might wear a crimson sash to church, her silent protest wrapped around her waist. These tiny rebellions were not acts of politics, but of longing the yearning to be seen, to feel beautiful in a world that equated poverty with sin. And yet, for all its cruelty, the system worked. The streets were visual hierarchies. You could tell who to bow to before they spoke, who to fear before they moved. The shimmering fabrics of the nobility caught the light like halos, while the poor dissolved into the dust-colored landscape around them. The world was perfectly ordered, perfectly unjust. Sometimes, when nobles traveled through towns, the people would gather just to look not at their faces, but at their clothes. The sight of a fur-lined robe or a gilded slipper was both miracle and mockery. For peasants who lived and died in the same mud, the rich might as well have been celestial beings. Their garments rustled like the wings of angels, angels who smelled faintly of musk, rose oil, and superiority. But even angels can trip on their robes. For the nobles themselves, these laws were both privilege and prison. To be born rich meant to perform richness forever. They could not dress simply without suspicion. A lord seen in plain wool might be accused of miserliness or heresy. A lady without jewels might be whispered to have fallen from grace. Their clothing was not comfort, it was burden. Silk could not be washed. Velvet grew heavy with moisture. Fur stank in the rain. Each layer was armor, each thread a chain. They moved beautifully, yes, but not freely. The court tailors became as important as priests. Every hemline, every shade of color had to reflect divine hierarchy. There were even inspectors men appointed to monitor what others wore, to report violations to the crown. Imagine that. a world where morality was measured in inches of fabric and where sin might come in the form of too much lace. The irony was that beneath all this control, the medieval wardrobe told the same story for everyone, the story of decay. Silk rotted, velvet faded, and furs were eaten by moths. Even gold thread tarnished in damp halls. The fabrics of eternity, it turned out, had the lifespan of a season. The poorest peasants, wrapped in coarse wool, sometimes fared better, their clothes ugly but enduring, much like their lives. In this way, the hierarchy of cloth reflected the hierarchy of existence. The more beautiful, the more fragile. By night, when the curfew bell rang and candles were extinguished, all the colors vanished anyway. In the darkness, nobles and peasants were equal, shivering under the same sky, clothed in the same cold. The silks could not warm them, the jewels could not comfort them, and the velvet could not silence the sound of the wind. For a few hours each night, the laws of fabric ceased to matter. Only the morning would restore inequality. Still, the rules endured for centuries. Even as empires fell and faith shifted, the idea that status must be worn never disappeared. To be seen was to be safe. To be mistaken for someone higher or lower was to risk ruin. These laws were not merely about fashion, they were about fear. The fear that without visible order, chaos would slip through the seams. And yet, there was one unspoken truth everyone seemed to know. Beneath the garments, all bodies looked the same. Skin, bone, and breath, no decree could change that. But the Middle Ages were not an age of truth. They were an age of performance. And so the play continued, act after act, color after color, each stitch reinforcing a lie that felt safer than freedom. When we look back now, the sumptuary laws seem almost comical, a parade of pride and pettiness disguised as divine order. But to those who lived within them, they were the walls that kept the world upright. To break them was not just rebellion, it was existential collapse. The tunic, the gown, the headdress, they weren't merely garments. They were the language of power, the vocabulary of control. And as dawn breaks over our imagined medieval village, you can almost hear the rustle of wool and velvet again, the quiet conversation of class whispered through fabric, the peasants, brown and gray as the earth itself, the nobles, glimmering like fire in sunlight, each one stitched perfectly into place, a living tapestry of hierarchy, the theater of the ages, draped in cloth, where everyone played their part, and where the cost of disobedience could be measured, not just in coin, but in color. The laws of clothing, though draped in the language of virtue and restraint, were never truly about modesty. They were about control, a kind of quiet tyranny sewn into every hem. To dress within your rank was not a matter of personal choice. It was a declaration of loyalty to the social order, a visible signature of submission. What you wore determined not only how others saw you, but how you were permitted to exist within the fabric of the world. And that was precisely how the nobility intended it to be. The noble class feared imitation more than invasion. A peasant wielding a sword could be disarmed, but a peasant wearing silk, that was something far more dangerous. Clothing, after all, was power made visible, and visibility was everything. The illusion of divine hierarchy depended upon it. For centuries, Europe had been carefully trained to see wealth as virtue, elegance as grace, and roughness as sin. The nobility called it the natural order, as though God himself had appointed tailors to distinguish heaven from earth. Yet the truth was far more fragile. The system could only survive if no one dared to look too similar to those above them. In this fragile ecosystem of appearances, fashion became a weapon of the powerful. The rich wore extravagance like armor, bright and sharp as steel, a daily reminder that their superiority was not only ordained by heaven, but stitched into their sleeves. Gold thread was their chainmail, silk their banner, Every layer announced their divine right to exist above others. And because this visual order was all that held the illusion together, the nobility could not afford for anyone else to mimic it. The moment a commoner appeared too refined, too confident, too polished, the lie of divine separation began to unravel. So they wrote laws, one after another, each more intricate than the last, weaving a labyrinth of regulation around the body itself. These decrees were issued under the pretense of morality to preserve virtue, humility, and the dignity of one's station. But beneath that pious disguise lay fear. Fear that the illusion of superiority might crack. Fear that the world would see what lay beneath all those brocades and jewels. Ordinary flesh and bone, the same as everyone else's. To modern minds, the distinction between a silk sleeve and a wool tunic may seem trivial, but in the Middle Ages, it was the line between existence and erasure. A merchant who dressed too well could be fined into poverty. A widow who wore fur without title could lose her home. There are records of women publicly stripped of their garments and paraded through the streets for daring to wear what was forbidden. Their humiliation served as spectacle, a living sermon to remind the rest of the world that beauty had a price, and that price was obedience. It was not enough to be wealthy. One had to be visibly wealthy. Nobility depended upon the constant reaffirmation of their divinity through display. Their clothing was a performance of control, a costume that told the lower classes where to look and when to bow. They were taught to believe that finery was not made for comfort but for reverence. Velvet, silk, and fur became sacred materials, relics of human vanity elevated to religious significance. To wear them without permission was blasphemy against the order of the world. This obsession with appearance seeped into every corner of medieval life. Even the church, which claimed to reject materialism, was not immune. Bishops wrapped themselves in gold-threaded robes, their mitres gleaming with jewels, while preaching humility to congregations dressed in rags. The visual contradiction was staggering, yet the people accepted it because they had been trained to see splendor as a form of holiness. In this theater of divine hierarchy, fashion did not merely clothe the body, it clothed belief itself. The power of this illusion was so complete that even rebellion had to disguise itself in fabric. When merchants grew rich from trade, they longed to dress like nobles, to prove through color and texture that they had climbed above the mud of their birth. But the laws stopped them. They could build houses as large as a baron's, feast like a duke, even marry into minor aristocracy, but one embroidered sleeve too many, one shade of crimson too fine, and they risked punishment. It was as though the ruling class feared contagion not of disease, but of imitation. And yet imitation was inevitable. Humans have always been drawn to beauty, and beauty has always been an act of rebellion. In cities like Florence, London, and Paris, the wealthy merchant class quietly began to blur the lines between station and style. They hired tailors to recreate noble fashions in subtler fabrics, or dyed their linens in deep shades of blue and green colors, once restricted to royalty. It was a silent protest, a rebellion without banners, fought with scissors and thread. The nobility responded with fresh decrees, each one more desperate to preserve the illusion of separation. It was a war of seams, and for centuries it never stopped. These laws, absurd as they seem, were the scaffolding of a civilization terrified of collapse. Europe in the Middle Ages was a world built on scarcity of food, of security, of meaning. People needed to believe that some cosmic order held it all together. If the poor were meant to be poor, and the rich meant to be rich, then at least suffering made sense. Fashion became a visual theology, a daily reminder of where you stood in God's plan. The wool of the peasant and the silk of the Lord were not just garments, but sacraments. To wear what you were not meant to was to invite chaos, and chaos was the one sin no society could forgive. The strangest irony of all is that even the nobility became prisoners of their own invention. They could not dress simply, could not appear ordinary, could not show weakness. A nobleman without jewels was a scandal. A lady without adornment, a disgrace. Their wardrobes became cages of expectation, heavy with jewels and duty. They wore their wealth not with pride, but with fatigue. The laws that promised to preserve their supremacy also ensured their captivity, trapped forever in the shimmering illusion they themselves had built. At court, where appearances ruled more powerfully than kings, fashion became a silent language of manipulation. A woman's headdress could signify loyalty, rivalry, or ambition. The choice of color might flatter or insult. The wrong garment could end a career faster than a whispered scandal. Nobles competed not just in power, but in spectacle, who could outshine whom without crossing the line into vulgarity. They dressed as though watched by God himself, though in truth it was the eyes of their peers that mattered most. Even the smallest rebellion in clothing became a kind of heresy. To appear too humble might suggest criticism of the rich. To appear too lavish might suggest greed. Every choice was political. The law might dictate what you wore, but interpretation was everything. In that sense, the Middle Ages were not unlike a masquerade ball, everyone playing their part, terrified that the mask might slip. The peasants, watching from the margins, saw the absurdity but had no voice to name it. To them, the glittering garments of their rulers were not symbols of divine order, but reminders of distance. They were told the system kept the world safe, that if they remained in their place, the seasons would turn, the harvest would come, and their souls would find reward in heaven. But it was always the same heaven that excused the same hunger. And yet, for all its hypocrisy, the system endured. Generation after generation, the same laws were rewritten, reissued, reinterpreted, sometimes softened, sometimes sharpened, but never broken, because fashion, at its core, was never about beauty. It was about control, the kind that doesn't need soldiers or swords, only mirrors. To make a person believe that their poverty was visible proof of their moral worth was the greatest trick power ever played. By the end of the Middle Ages, these laws began to fade, replaced by the subtler tyranny of taste. But the structure remained. Even now, centuries later, the echo of those old decrees lingers in the way we judge each other by clothes, by brands, by the illusion of polish. The medieval world may have died, but the theater of appearances lives on, quieter, cleaner, but not so different. And so, in the grand story of human control, the sumptuary laws were never just about what one wore. They were about what one believed, that hierarchy could be sown, that power could be dyed, that obedience could be measured in thread. Beneath the silks and furs, beneath the pride and the fear, one truth endured. The laws of fashion were not meant to protect the body, but to keep the soul in its place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a profound shift overtook the village. The golden warmth of daylight receded, and an eerie calm descended. The air grew colder, a crispness creeping into every crevice, every corner of the once bustling streets. Shadows lengthened, stretching like dark fingers across the cobblestones. The fading light was no longer the quiet end of the day, but the herald of something far more foreboding. The curfew bell, its deep tolling sound reverberating across the landscape, marked the definitive end to the day's activities. It was a sound so familiar, yet so ominous, that it sent a shiver through the bones of every villager. The bell's clang was not just a signal. It was a command, a decree. The fires must be extinguished, the flickering candles snuffed out. The soft glow of warmth that had filled the homes was now replaced by darkness, a vast, inescapable void. The hearths, once the center of family life, now stood cold and unwelcoming. For the people living in these medieval villages, the curfew was more than just a rule, it was a matter of survival. The goal, so simple in its intent, was to prevent the destruction of homes and livelihoods. The villages, many of which were made primarily of wood, were incredibly vulnerable to the smallest spark. A single flame could sweep through the narrow, tightly packed streets, reducing everything to smoldering ruins. In an age before fire departments and modern firefighting tools, the curfew bell acted as a safeguard, a way to minimize risk and protect the community from the ever-present threat of fire. But the consequences of this nightly ritual were far more complicated than simply preventing catastrophe. As darkness fully enveloped the village, a blanket of silence followed. The lively sounds of daily life, chatter, laughter, the clinking of tools fell away, leaving nothing but the sharp rustle of wind and the occasional creak of a wooden structure. The fires, once crackling merrily, were reduced to smoldering embers. The warmth of the day had been banished, and the cold now held sway. The simple act of closing the shutters and putting out the flames created an atmosphere that was at once sacred and suffocating. For the poor, especially those living in small cottages that offered little protection from the elements, the curfew imposed a harsh and unyielding solitude. The cold became their constant companion, creeping into their bones with each passing night. The fire that had warmed them was now gone, and they were left in a stifling darkness, where even their breath seemed to freeze in the air. The dampness from the earth seeped in through the cracks of their walls, making the cold feel almost like a living presence. It was not just a discomfort, it was a form of punishment. Beyond the walls of the village, the night itself seemed to come alive with danger. The curfew was as much about control as it was about safety. It kept the villagers inside, where they were less likely to encounter the unpredictable dangers that came with the night. The darkness beyond the familiar boundaries was known for its unpredictability. Wild animals, thieves, and even the occasional marauding band of soldiers could strike under the cover of night. The curfew, in essence, confined the villagers to their homes, sheltering them from the unknown horrors that lurked just beyond the walls. But it wasn't just fear of external threats that the curfew bred. Within the homes, a different kind of fear took root. With the closing of doors, the extinguishing of fires, the people were left alone with their thoughts, their isolation. For many, the night became a time of internal reflection, sometimes an opportunity for fear to take on new dimensions. The long hours of quiet were often accompanied by unease, and a sense of vulnerability crept into the hearts of even the bravest villagers. They were left in the dark, not just physically, but emotionally. There was no escaping the stillness of the night, a stillness that, while outwardly peaceful, could often be unsettling. For the wealthy, the curfew was a slightly different experience. While they too observed the ritual, they did so from a place of privilege. Their homes were large, stone buildings, often far removed from the vulnerability of the village's wooden structures. They could keep their fires burning, their homes warm, their lives comfortable, all while the poor huddled in their cold, dark cottages. The curfew became yet another marker of inequality, another division between the classes. While the peasants shivered in the dark, the nobles enjoyed the warmth and safety of their homes, untouched by the cold that plagued the common folk. This gap between the wealthy and the poor, evident in the curfew, was not just a matter of physical comfort, but also one of power. The curfew, ostensibly put in place to protect the village, also acted as a tool of control. The nobles, who had the luxury of warmth and light, were not subjected to the same rules as the peasants. The curfew for them was a mere formality, a societal norm that, unlike for the lower classes, did not carry the same weight of survival. In fact, it was just another reminder of the distance between them and the rest of the village. As the night wore on, the village succumbed to the silence that the curfew had imposed. The sense of dread, once palpable, began to fade into a tired resignation. Yet, for some, the fear lingered, the fear that the night would hold something darker, something more sinister. In a world so heavily dependent on faith, Superstition often took root, and the long, dark hours of the curfew were the perfect breeding ground for whispered fears. Even the faithful, who had relied on the protection of prayer and the Lord's guidance, could not escape the gnawing fear that came with the night. In the quiet that followed the toll of the curfew bell, people were left to their own thoughts. The stillness that settled over the village was not a calm, serene stillness, but a heavy, almost oppressive silence. It was the silence of a world that was constantly aware of its own fragility, a world where even the smallest mistake or misstep could lead to catastrophe. The curfew bell, with its commanding toll, served as a reminder of the precariousness of life in the Middle Ages. It was a world where survival depended on obedience, and the simple act of extinguishing a flame was both an act of protection and of confinement. For all its practical purposes, the curfew bell was also a symbol of control, of order, and most importantly, of fear. The village, trapped between the safety of its walls and the dangers of the unknown night, could do little but obey. The bell had spoken, and they would listen. They would extinguish the fire, douse the light, and wait in the darkness for the next day to dawn. The curfew had not only closed the doors to the village, but had also closed off any possibility of escape from the cold, the silence, and the fear of the unknown. In the end, the curfew bell was not just a reminder of the dangers of fire, but also of the fragility of the human condition. It was a sound that marked the end of the day, but it also marked the beginning of a long, cold, and often fearful night. The tolling of the bell was not the end of the world, but it was the end of the warmth, the end of the light, and the beginning of the darkness that could not be outrun. And as the villagers huddled together, wrapped in blankets and warmth that came from each other, they understood that survival in such a world was not about comfort, but about endurance. It was the quiet endurance of a people who knew that the night would come again, as it always did, and with it, the toll of the curfew bell. As the bell tolled, the people of the village huddled close, their breath forming visible clouds in the cold night air. The curfew had descended, like the darkness itself, with an authority that could not be questioned. Fireplaces, once blazing with warmth, were now extinguished, candles snuffed out, leaving only shadows to creep along the wooden walls. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of a law imposed upon the people, an unyielding rule that demanded obedience, but offered no warmth, no comfort in return. Yet, as the flames died in the homes of the poor, the contrast could not be more striking. Far above the village, in the towering stone castles of the nobles, the fires continued to burn. Inside their great halls, where tapestries of rich reds and golds adorned the walls, the nobles remained warm, surrounded by the opulence that signified their position in the social hierarchy. The curfew was not something they feared. For them, the night was simply another hour in which to enjoy their luxuries, to sip wine, and laugh around a fire that illuminated their gilded surroundings. The curfew, as it was designed, was not about protecting the common folk. It was a law meant to protect property, to prevent fires from sweeping through the wooden homes of the village that lay in the shadow of the nobles' estates. But what was truly protected by this law? It was not the safety of the people, nor their well-being. It was the preservation of wealth, the protection of the homes of the elite. The poor, whose homes were made of thatch and wood, were left in the darkness, freezing in the cold that crept into their bodies as they sat huddled in the shadows of their damp, drafty cottages. The fire that the nobles enjoyed, the warmth that kept them comfortable, was never extended to the villagers. While the lower classes were forced to sit in the cold, beneath a blanket of darkness and silence, the noble families lived in a realm of warmth and luxury. The fire, it seemed, was a luxury reserved for those who could afford it, those who were born into wealth, or had the means to keep their homes safe from the ravages of the cold and the night. In the villages, the cold was not just a physical presence, it was a reminder of the divide between the classes. The curfew made it clear, in the most brutal of ways, who was protected by the law and who was not. The wealth of the noble classes was not just measured in land, or gold, or jewels. It was measured in the warmth of their homes, in the light that illuminated their lives, while the common folk sat in the dark, shivering from the chill. The contrast between the glowing castles and the freezing cottages could not be more stark, and the curfew only served to highlight that divide. The law, in this case, was not a safeguard for the people. It was a means of reinforcing the social order, of ensuring that the elite remained comfortable while the rest of society endured hardship. It was a strange and cruel paradox. The curfew, ostensibly meant to protect everyone from the dangers of fire, ended up becoming a symbol of inequality. The peasants, those who worked the land, tilled the fields, and fed the kingdom, were the ones who suffered. Their lives were regulated by rules that sought to protect property, not people. Their bodies, like their homes, were exposed to the elements, while the elite were kept safely ensconced in their stone castles, their lives untouched by the cold and the dark. The curfew bell, which echoed through the village at night, became a sound of division. It was no longer a signal of safety or protection, but a reminder of the harsh reality of social inequality. The poor were left to sit in the dark, in the cold, while the nobles continued their lives in warmth and comfort. It was not just the dark of night that separated the two classes, but the vast chasm of wealth, power, and privilege that existed between them. As the years went by, the curfew remained, its toll a constant reminder of the system that kept the rich in warmth and the poor in the cold. The law that was supposed to protect everyone became a tool of oppression, a way to ensure that the lower classes remained subservient, their lives dictated by rules that were designed to maintain the status quo. The curfew was not just a rule, it was a statement, a proclamation of power and privilege, a way to remind everyone where they stood in the great hierarchy of life. For the villagers, the curfew was a cruel reminder that their lives were not their own. They were at the mercy of those who held the power, the land, and the wealth. The curfew, which was supposed to protect them, only served to expose their vulnerability. The darkness that fell after the bell tolled was not just the absence of light, it was the absence of hope, the absence of warmth, the absence of agency. It was the cold truth that the poor were left to endure while the rich remained untouched, safe behind the walls of their grand homes. In the end, the curfew was not just a rule about fire safety, it was a symbol of control, a way to remind the peasants of their place. It was a law that separated the privileged from the powerless, a law that ensured the rich would always remain warm, while the poor were left to freeze in the dark. And as the curfew bell tolled each night, it was not just a call for safety, it was a reminder of who held the power and who had to live in the cold. As the bell tolled, the people of the village huddled close, their breath forming visible clouds in the cold night air. The curfew had descended, like the darkness itself, with an authority that could not be questioned. Fireplaces, once blazing with warmth, were now extinguished, candles snuffed out, leaving only shadows to creep along the wooden walls. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of a law imposed upon the people, an unyielding rule that demanded obedience, but offered no warmth, no comfort in return. Yet, as the flames died in the homes of the poor, the contrast could not be more striking. Far above the village, in the towering stone castles of the nobles, the fires continued to burn. Inside their great halls, where tapestries of rich reds and golds adorned the walls, the nobles remained warm, surrounded by the opulence that signified their position in the social hierarchy. The curfew was not something they feared. For them, the night was simply another hour in which to enjoy their luxuries, to sip wine, and laugh around a fire that illuminated their gilded surroundings. The curfew, as it was designed, was not about protecting the common folk. It was a law meant to protect property, to prevent fires from sweeping through the wooden homes of the village that lay in the shadow of the nobles' estates. But what was truly protected by this law? It was not the safety of the people, nor their well-being. It was the preservation of wealth, the protection of the homes of the elite. The poor, whose homes were made of thatch and wood, were left in the darkness, freezing in the cold that crept into their bodies as they sat huddled in the shadows of their damp, drafty cottages. The fire that the nobles enjoyed, the warmth that kept them comfortable, was never extended to the villagers. While the lower classes were forced to sit in the cold, beneath a blanket of darkness and silence, the noble families lived in a realm of warmth and luxury. The fire, it seemed, was a luxury reserved for those who could afford it, those who were born into wealth or had the means to keep their homes safe from the ravages of the cold and the night. In the villages, the cold was not just a physical presence, it was a reminder of the divide between the classes. The curfew made it clear, in the most brutal of ways, who was protected by the law and who was not. The wealth of the noble classes was not just measured in land or gold or jewels. It was measured in the warmth of their homes, in the light that illuminated their lives, while the common folk sat in the dark, shivering from the chill. The contrast between the glowing castles and the freezing cottages could not be more stark, and the curfew only served to highlight that divide. The law, in this case, was not a safeguard for the people. It was a means of reinforcing the social order, of ensuring that the elite remained comfortable while the rest of society endured hardship. It was a strange and cruel paradox. The curfew, ostensibly meant to protect everyone from the dangers of fire, ended up becoming a symbol of inequality. The peasants, those who worked the land, tilled the fields, and fed the kingdom, were the ones who suffered. Their lives were regulated by rules that sought to protect property, not people. Their bodies, like their homes, were exposed to the elements, while the elite were kept safely ensconced in their stone castles, their lives untouched by the cold and the dark. The curfew bell, which echoed through the village at night, became a sound of division. It was no longer a signal of safety or protection, but a reminder of the harsh reality of social inequality. The poor were left to sit in the dark, in the cold, while the nobles continued their lives in warmth and comfort. It was not just the dark of night that separated the two classes, but the vast chasm of wealth, power, and privilege that existed between them. As the years went by, the curfew remained, its toll a constant reminder of the system that kept the rich in warmth and the poor in the cold. The law that was supposed to protect everyone became a tool of oppression, a way to ensure that the lower classes remained subservient, their lives dictated by rules that were designed to maintain the status quo. The curfew was not just a rule, it was a statement, a proclamation of power and privilege, a way to remind everyone where they stood in the great hierarchy of life. For the villagers, the curfew was a cruel reminder that their lives were not their own. They were at the mercy of those who held the power, the land, and the wealth. The curfew, which was supposed to protect them, only served to expose their vulnerability. The darkness that fell after the bell tolled was not just the absence of light, it was the absence of hope, the absence of warmth, the absence of agency. It was the cold truth that the poor were left to endure while the rich remained untouched, safe behind the walls of their grand homes. In the end, the curfew was not just a rule about fire safety, it was a symbol of control, a way to remind the peasants of their place. It was a law that separated the privileged from the powerless, a law that ensured the rich would always remain warm, while the poor were left to freeze in the dark. And as the curfew bell tolled each night, it was not just a call for safety, it was a reminder of who held the power and who had to live in the cold. The Church's dietary laws were as much a reflection of faith as they were a pragmatic solution to the challenges of medieval life. Every year, the faithful of Christendom observed strict fasting periods, most notably during Fridays, Lent, and Advent. These days marked a time when the consumption of meat was prohibited, and adherents were expected to demonstrate their devotion by refraining from indulgence. But for the peasants and common folk, this abstinence was not a mere spiritual exercise. It was a practical necessity, a way of life carved out in the harshest of conditions. On Fridays, when meat was forbidden, peasants turned to fish, grains, and pottage, a thick stew made from whatever vegetables or scraps they could gather. In many ways, the law of fasting, though deeply tied to faith and religious discipline, was also a practical response to the limitations of the medieval world. Meat was expensive and often reserved for the wealthy. Fish, on the other hand, could be caught from rivers or the sea, and grains were abundant, though hardly a satisfying meal. These alternative meals became staples of peasant life, not out of choice but necessity. While the clergy preached restraint and piety, the underlying purpose of the dietary laws was often far more economical. The Church, after all, controlled vast amounts of land and resources across Europe. By enforcing dietary restrictions, particularly those that limited the consumption of meat, the Church effectively managed resources, regulating food supplies to ensure that they were distributed in a way that could support the growing population of clergy, monasteries, and the general population. The Church's influence over these dietary choices also allowed it to maintain its control over the economy, guiding how the peasantry interacted with the land and its goods. Fasting was a form of moral discipline. It was a way of demonstrating one's devotion to God, a method of purifying the body and soul. But it was also an economic policy that allowed for the redistribution of resources in a time when food could be scarce. By encouraging fasting and limiting the consumption of meat, the Church ensured that resources were preserved for those who needed them, most often the clergy or the wealthy, who could afford to live in relative comfort. The peasants, in contrast, lived in a world where food was never guaranteed. With each fast, they were reminded of their place in the social hierarchy, their bodies subjected to the dictates of religious and economic law. The peasants did not enjoy these fasts. For them, meat was not just a luxury, it was sustenance. The prohibitions on eating meat for extended periods left many with little to fill their stomachs but bread, fish, or whatever scraps could be scavenged from the land. The diet was not just spiritually difficult but physically taxing. Yet they observed the laws, year after year, as they always had, for the fear of divine punishment was real. To go against the Church's dictates was not just to risk displeasing God, it was to risk being excluded from the very social fabric that held the medieval world together. Lent, which lasted for 40 days leading up to Easter, was the most stringent of these periods. The faithful, including the poor, were required to fast rigorously, with some surviving only on bread and water for weeks. The thought of fasting during these times of scarcity seemed both a test of endurance and a demonstration of humility before God. While the noble classes could retreat to their grand homes with ample food stores and private kitchens, the peasants, bound by their vows, often had little but their faith to sustain them. The concept of fasting, however, had a dual purpose. It was not only about spiritual discipline, it was also about conserving food, protecting livestock, and ensuring that what was available could be sustained through the lean months. The Church, in its wisdom, had recognized that the overconsumption of meat could deplete resources quickly. By enforcing these rules, they allowed for the protection of the land's most valuable assets, the cows that produced milk, the pigs that provided lard, and the sheep that offered wool. If people continued to feast on meat, especially in times when food was already in short supply, it would inevitably lead to food scarcity and economic collapse. Of course, the irony of the fasting rules did not escape the attention of those who lived under them. While the poor were required to abstain from meat, the rich were rarely bound by such constraints. Nobles and members of the clergy could often feast on meat at will, and during major feasts or religious celebrations, meat would flow freely. The Church, in its wealth and power, could afford such luxuries, while the peasantry, though devout, was left to scrape by on meager meals. For them, fasting was a matter of survival, not piety, a way of enduring rather than thriving. The rich, on the other hand, viewed these fasting laws as a sign of moral and religious superiority, a way to align themselves with divine will, while their indulgence in meat, wine, and luxury was seen as a demonstration of their high status. In this way, the fasting laws of the Middle Ages exemplified a deeply entrenched system of inequality, dressed up as religious devotion. They served as a constant reminder of who held power in the medieval world and who did not. The peasants, bound to their land, were denied the simple pleasures of meat and wine, while the wealthy, through their indulgences, perpetuated a system that kept them firmly at the top of the social ladder. Even as they observed the fast, the poor were reminded of their place in a world that seemed built more on the whims of the powerful than on any true sense of justice or fairness. And so, the Church's dietary laws, while offering a means to enforce religious discipline and to safeguard resources, also perpetuated the medieval world's rigid class system. In the end, fasting was not only about faith but also about maintaining control over the masses, ensuring that the poor remained hungry and subjugated while the rich enjoyed their abundance. The piety of the masses was manipulated to serve the political and economic interests of those in power. Fasting, therefore, was not just a personal sacrifice. It was a powerful tool used by the Church to shape the lives of those who had little choice but to comply. Through the laws governing diet, the medieval world was a place where the most sacred acts were intimately intertwined with the most practical concerns of survival. The rich and powerful controlled the resources, and the poor, bound by faith, had little choice but to endure, their lives dictated by both divine and earthly laws. The fasting regulations were a reminder of this divide, a law that not only defined what people ate, but also defined who had control over the very means of sustenance. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't just faith that led to the banning of meat on certain days. It was a mixture of practicality, survival, and social control, crafted within the religious framework of the time. These dietary restrictions, though deeply rooted in the concept of piety, were in fact a complex strategy that served several purposes, from ensuring food resources for the community to maintaining control over the masses. Let's start with the role of the Church in medieval life. In this era, the Church's influence extended far beyond spiritual matters. It shaped how people lived, ate, and even thought. The law of the Church, those unspoken yet deeply ingrained practices, told people how to live, what to wear, how to pray, and even what they could eat. The fasting days, where meat was forbidden, were not just acts of spiritual purification. They were also deeply practical in nature, though many couldn't see beyond the surface of religious observance. The ban on meat during specific times, such as Fridays, Lent, and Advent, is a well-known feature of medieval life. But to understand the full impact of this law, we must dig deeper into the economy and the necessity for controlling resources. You see, meat was a luxury. It was expensive to raise livestock, particularly for the poor, and it consumed valuable land and resources. The Church's commandment to abstain from meat was a clever way to preserve these resources. By banning meat on specific days, the Church wasn't simply concerned with the soul's purification. It was also ensuring that there would be enough resources, especially milk, eggs, and labor from livestock, to keep the economy in balance. A cow, for instance, could provide milk, but only if it wasn't slaughtered for meat. So, by cutting back on meat consumption, it allowed for more milk production, and dairy became a crucial part of the medieval diet. Furthermore, it wasn't just dairy that benefited from this system. The fish industry flourished under this rule. With meat off the table, fish, particularly salted fish, became the main protein source during fasting periods. For fishermen, this created a lucrative trade. supplying fish to towns and monasteries across Europe. Salted herring and cod, for example, became staple foods in many parts of Europe, with their preservation techniques enabling long-lasting supplies during the fasting season. Now, beyond the practicalities of food preservation and economics, there was also the psychological and social aspect. The ban on meat created a clear division between the wealthy and the poor, with food playing a central role in that divide. The wealthy could afford to eat meat regularly. They dined on roasted meats, exotic spices, and delicacies from across Europe. The poor, on the other hand, had to make do with simpler fare barley loaves, vegetables, and fish. The restriction of meat consumption wasn't just a physical limitation, it was a powerful social statement. The church cleverly used this disparity to maintain control over the population. By limiting access to food like meat, it was creating a controlled environment where only certain classes had access to the finest resources. The richer classes could indulge in their desires for expensive meats, while the peasants were left to subsist on whatever they could grow or fish. This division was baked into the very diet of medieval society. However, there was a secondary effect of this ban, one that many might not have seen coming. In this world of scarce resources, dietary laws became a method of economic control. By encouraging the consumption of fish, the church ensured that the fishing industry remained a key player in the medieval economy. Fishermen became some of the wealthiest individuals in coastal towns, controlling the production and sale of salted fish, which was in high demand during fasting periods. While the church preached the sanctity of fasting and penance, it also strengthened industries and maintained an economic flow that benefited the church and the monarchy. But even beyond the economic implications, the church's dietary restrictions also had a profound impact on medieval culinary practices. The creativity required to make meatless meals not only sustained people through difficult times, but also birthed the development of certain types of food. Without the option of meat, people were forced to come up with new ways to prepare and preserve food. The medieval world saw the emergence of dishes like pottage, which was a hearty, vegetable-based stew. Pottage became a staple for many people, its versatility allowing it to be prepared with whatever vegetables or grains were available. It was a dish that could feed a large family, or even an entire village, making it an essential part of medieval life. In some cases, the people's ingenuity with food even led to new agricultural practices. For example, the church's fasting laws indirectly encouraged crop rotation, as farmers needed to ensure that their fields could produce the necessary grains and vegetables for these meatless periods. The medieval focus on crops like barley, rye, and oats was also partly a result of the church's laws. These grains became the foundation for bread and porridge, both of which were staple foods for the majority of people. It's also important to note the lasting cultural impact of these dietary rules. The taboo against meat during certain religious periods reinforced the connection between the body and the spirit. To abstain from meat was not just a matter of physical nourishment, it was seen as a spiritual exercise. The idea of fasting and abstaining from meat during holy times reflected the medieval belief that the body had to be disciplined in order to achieve spiritual purity. And yet, the contradiction between what people were expected to do and what they actually did was clear. Despite the religious justification for fasting, it was also an economic strategy to maintain order and ensure a steady flow of resources. As time passed, the significance of these dietary laws began to wane. But for many centuries, the church's laws governed not just what people ate, but how they lived. The church was able to control the rhythms of daily life, dictating when to eat, and even what not to eat. It was a system that influenced every aspect of medieval society, from food production to class divisions. As the Middle Ages ended and the Renaissance dawned, people's relationships with food and the church began to shift. But even as food became more varied and the importance of fasting lessened, the legacy of these rules remained. The concept of the fast and the cultural norms surrounding food continued to shape culinary practices in Europe for centuries to come. Today, when we think about medieval diets, we can still see echoes of these practices in modern food laws and customs, reminding us of the lasting impact of religion, politics, and economics on what we eat. The story of meat, its ban, and its underlying significance is one of survival, control, and adaptation. It's a story of how something as simple as food, something we take for granted, can shape the course of history and influence the way people live, eat, and think. Even in the most unexpected places, like the medieval feast table, we find a reflection of the broader patterns of society and power. So next time you sit down to a meal, whether it's a hearty stew or a simple salad, think back to a time when what you ate wasn't just a personal choice, it was a statement of your place in the world. And as you take a bite, remember that the medieval world was built on more than just castles and kings. It was built on food, faith, and the struggle to survive in a world of limited resources. In the heart of the medieval world, the forests were not simply a part of the natural landscape. They were arenas of power, wealth, and strict control. Once, these woodlands may have been places of freedom for the common folk, a place where they could forage, hunt, and sustain themselves. But that was not the case for long, especially when the lords of the land laid claim to the vast forests surrounding their estates. These once public spaces transformed into private domains, forbidden for anyone not bearing the noble title. The laws of the hunt, often called game laws, were a symbol of the aristocracy's dominance over both land and life. For the peasants, these laws were a source of deep injustice. While the nobility enjoyed the right to hunt for sport, peasants were bound by rules that dictated they could not even touch a rabbit or gather a deer's carcass, let alone take a wild boar for themselves. In a time when food was scarce and survival was an ever-present struggle, the right to hunt was not just a privilege, it was a matter of life and death. But for the peasants, these rights were as distant and unattainable as the stars. The act of poaching, even the smallest infraction, was met with fierce punishment. If a peasant was caught hunting in the noble's forest or killing a game animal, the consequences could be brutal. The punishment for poaching could range from brutal mutilations, such as the cutting off of hands, to more severe penalties, including execution. To steal a rabbit, to trap a deer, was an offense worthy of dismemberment or even death. It was as if the land itself had been transformed into a fortress, with the peasants as the intruders, not allowed to touch what had once been a shared resource. But the woods, once so open and free, had become forbidden territory. The nobles' claim to the forest went beyond just hunting rights. It became a mark of privilege that distinguished the rich from the poor. The king, the lords, and the knights of the realm considered the forest their private playgrounds. They could wander the woods, hunt the deer, chase the wild boar, all while the peasants looked on, hungry and desperate, their rights trampled upon by the sheer weight of social structure. The once open woods, full of life and resources, became restricted zones, a place where nature itself had been privatized and locked away from those who needed it most. At the heart of this system was the idea that the wilderness, like the land itself, was to be controlled. The forests weren't just about nature, they were about power. The game laws were a means for the elite to maintain their dominance. Hunting was no longer a simple matter of gathering food. It was about asserting control over nature itself, claiming it as a possession, something to be flaunted, a luxury. The nobility hunted not for survival, but for sport, for leisure, to display their wealth and status. And the punishment for those who dared defy these laws, to even touch a rabbit or a bird, was a cruel reminder of who held the real power. In this system, nature was no longer free. It was owned, regulated, and policed by the wealthy elite. The once natural landscape became an artificial construct, a way of reinforcing the social order. The forest, like the land, was now private property, and its resources were reserved solely for the privileged few. It was an unsettling paradox. The more you owned, the more access you had to the bounty of nature. The less you owned, the more you were denied the very essence of life itself. The very act of living, of hunting and gathering, had become an act of defiance against the social order. The game laws were not simply rules about hunting. They were a constant reminder of the divisions that defined medieval society. The peasants, who lived on the margins of life, could see the abundance of nature around them, yet they were excluded from it. The forests that surrounded their villages and hamlets were just beyond their reach, a source of food, fuel, and livelihood, but always kept out of their grasp. The nobility, on the other hand, could walk freely through those woods, hunt at will, and take whatever they pleased. In the eyes of the nobility, the laws were necessary to preserve the social hierarchy. The peasants, in their eyes, were not worthy of the bounty of nature. They were the workers, the laborers, meant to serve the elite, not to partake in the luxuries the aristocracy enjoyed. The concept of private property, even in the wild, was an extension of this belief in the supremacy of the nobility. By claiming the woods and the game within them, the aristocracy not only solidified their status but also ensured that the peasants remained in their place. The forests were a tool of division, reinforcing the rigid boundaries between the classes. Thus, the forests of medieval Europe became symbols of inequality. The very land that should have been shared by all was claimed by a few. The game laws were not just about protecting resources, but about asserting control, about reminding the lower classes that they had no rights to the natural world that surrounded them. The laws made it clear: the peasants were bound to the earth, working it and tilling it, while the nobles were free to roam and take whatever they desired. The forests, once the domain of freedom and sustenance, became the backdrop for a harsh and cruel reality where the rich could indulge in nature's bounty while the poor were left to struggle for survival. It was a system that reinforced the idea of divine right and the belief that power was inherent in the aristocracy. To walk through the woods was a privilege reserved for the few, while the majority had to make do with what little they could gather from the scraps that remained. This was a world in which nature itself had been privatized, and its riches were guarded by blood. This stark division, and the laws that upheld it, were the very heart of the medieval social order. It was a time when power, wealth, and nature itself were inextricably linked, and where the boundaries of society were defined by the right to control the natural world. The lords of the hunt were not just the masters of the forest, they were the masters of life itself, holding the keys to the land and the bounty it offered, while the peasants were left to watch, longing for what they could never have. It was a reminder that in the medieval world, nature was not free, but a commodity to be guarded by those who held the power to do so. In the medieval world, where life was fragile and justice was a matter of faith, the system of trial by ordeal reigned supreme. For centuries, this method of determining guilt or innocence was woven into the fabric of legal practice, a practice that placed an immense amount of trust in divine intervention. Unlike modern trials where evidence, witness testimony, and logic guide the course of justice, medieval trials relied on something far more dramatic: pain, suffering, and the belief that God would reveal the truth through a test of physical endurance. The accused were not given the opportunity to present a defense, nor were they entitled to a fair trial in the way we might understand it today. Instead, they were subjected to one of several grisly and painful trials, where their fate rested entirely on their ability to survive or endure the ordeal they were put through. If they survived unharmed, they were considered innocent, and if they succumbed to the pain, they were guilty. In this world, survival was seen as divine proof of innocence, and suffering was seen as God's way of revealing the truth. One of the most horrifying of these trials involved boiling water. The accused would be made to plunge their hand or arm into a cauldron of boiling water and pull out an object, such as a ring or a coin, that had been dropped into the pot. If the person survived without significant injury, they were deemed innocent, but if their hand was burned or scalded, it was considered a clear sign of their guilt. The trial by boiling water was a spectacle of fear, a cruel test that left the person at the mercy of not just the boiling water, but also the judgment of those observing. Another trial by ordeal involved the use of burning irons. In this trial, the accused would be forced to carry a red-hot iron a certain distance, often around the length of a church aisle. If they succeeded without injury, their innocence was presumed. But if their hand was burned or they faltered under the heat, they were deemed guilty. The agonizing pain of holding a burning iron was a test not just of strength, but of endurance, of a person's ability to survive what seemed like certain death. It was an event that made no room for logic, only for the spectacle of pain and the belief that the will of God could be revealed through suffering. Perhaps the most dramatic of all the medieval trials was the ordeal by combat, where the accused were forced to fight to the death. This trial, often used for serious accusations such as treason, pitted the accused against a champion selected by their accuser. If the accused emerged victorious, their innocence was confirmed. If they lost, it was proof of their guilt. In these deadly duels, there was no room for evidence, only the bloodshed and the brutal reality of combat. The belief was that God would not allow an innocent person to be defeated in such a trial, and therefore, the outcome was a direct reflection of divine will. Throughout these ordeals, the role of God as the ultimate judge was unquestioned. The medieval mind did not rely on the precision of legal argument or the rational analysis of facts. Instead, it trusted in divine judgment, in the belief that God's will would be made known through these painful tests. The system was as much about faith as it was about justice. Faith in the idea that God was present in every moment, even in the most harrowing experiences of human suffering. But while the trial by ordeal was seen as a way of invoking God's judgment, it was also a system that placed immense power in the hands of those administering the trials. The trial by ordeal did not allow for the possibility of error or miscarriage of justice. If a person was innocent but failed to survive the trial, their death was considered a just consequence of their guilt. In this harsh and unforgiving system, there was no room for nuance or understanding. The test itself was the ultimate verdict, and survival was the only evidence that mattered. As with many aspects of medieval life, the trial by ordeal was a deeply ingrained part of the culture, one that reflected the medieval mindset and its understanding of divine will and justice. Yet, as centuries passed, the inherent cruelty of these trials began to be questioned. Even the Church, which had once sanctioned such practices, began to see the flaws in a system that allowed the innocent to suffer while the guilty could escape without consequence. By the 13th century, as reason and rationality slowly began to replace superstition and divine intervention, the trial by ordeal was officially banned by the Church. The death of the ordeal system marked the beginning of a new era in justice, one where the law was based on evidence, logic, and reason. Yet, even as this brutal practice was dismantled, it left behind a legacy of fear and superstition that would continue to influence the legal system for centuries to come. The medieval obsession with divine judgment and the belief that pain could reveal truth became a powerful symbol of a world where faith and reason struggled to coexist. Looking back on these trials today, it is difficult to imagine how anyone could have thought that such methods of determining guilt or innocence were fair, let alone just. Yet, in the context of medieval society, these ordeals were an integral part of the system, designed to uphold the belief that God was the ultimate arbiter of truth. The idea that physical suffering could be a path to divine revelation seemed logical to those living in a world defined by uncertainty, fear, and superstition. The trial by ordeal was a brutal reminder of the power of belief and the extent to which society was willing to go to maintain a sense of divine justice. It was a world where faith often supplanted reason, and where the human body was subjected to unimaginable pain in the name of truth. The memory of these trials remains a chilling testament to the ways in which fear, superstition, and religion shaped the medieval world. A world where survival was not just a matter of endurance, but a matter of divine will. In the medieval world, the concept of justice was not defined by the logical, evidence-based principles we are familiar with today. Instead, it was shaped by fear, superstition, and the belief in divine intervention. One of the most chilling practices of medieval law was the trial by ordeal. This was a system in which the accused were subjected to brutal, often life-threatening tests, and the outcome of these tests was considered to be proof of their innocence or guilt. The most chilling part of this practice was the belief that survival itself was proof of innocence, and that the suffering endured during the ordeal was a sign of divine judgment. Pain, not evidence, was the deciding factor in determining guilt or innocence, and in many cases, it was believed that God himself was the ultimate judge. The trial by ordeal was, in essence, a form of divine justice. It was not based on legal procedures, nor was it concerned with collecting evidence or witness testimony. Instead, it was a system that placed the fate of the accused entirely in the hands of God. The trials often involved physical pain or danger, with the idea being that if someone was innocent, God would protect them and they would survive the trial unscathed. On the other hand, if the accused was guilty, they would suffer during the ordeal, and the pain they experienced would be seen as divine retribution. In this world, the judgment of God was final, and the trial was seen as a way of revealing divine truth. One of the most common forms of trial by ordeal involved boiling water. The accused would be required to plunge their hands into a cauldron of boiling water and pull out a ring or a coin that had been dropped inside. If the person survived the test without severe burns, they were deemed innocent. If their hands were badly burned, it was considered a sign of their guilt. The trial by boiling water was terrifying, as the outcome was entirely dependent on the accused's ability to endure unbearable pain. It was a test of both physical and mental endurance, and those who survived were seen as having been blessed by God, while those who failed were viewed as guilty. Another form of ordeal involved burning irons. In this trial, the accused would be forced to carry a red-hot iron a certain distance, usually along a set path. If they completed the journey without injury, they were considered innocent. However, if they were burned, it was seen as a clear sign of their guilt. This trial was particularly brutal because the heat from the iron could cause severe burns, and the pain endured by the accused was unimaginable. In the eyes of medieval society, this pain was the price of justice, and it was believed that God would not allow an innocent person to suffer in such a manner. Perhaps the most notorious form of trial by ordeal was the ordeal by combat. In this trial, the accused was forced to fight a champion chosen by their accuser. The combat was often a fight to the death, and the outcome was considered to be a direct reflection of the accused's innocence or guilt. If the accused emerged victorious, they were considered innocent, while a defeat meant they were guilty. This trial was particularly terrifying because it allowed no room for negotiation or evidence. The fight itself was seen as a divine test, and it was believed that God would ensure the innocent person triumphed. If they lost, it was seen as a sign of divine judgment. The trial by ordeal system had an aura of finality about it. Once a person had undergone the ordeal, the outcome was considered to be absolute. There was no appeal, no second chances, and no way to challenge the decision. If the accused survived the ordeal, they were declared innocent. If they failed, they were guilty, and in some cases, the punishment for that guilt could be death. This system of justice, based on pain and survival, meant that the innocent could be punished just as easily as the guilty, and the process of determining innocence or guilt was entirely out of the hands of the accused. The trial by ordeal was not limited to just these forms of physical pain. In some cases, the accused were subjected to ordeals of water or ordeals of fire, which involved immersing the person in water or making them walk through fire. These tests were seen as a way for God to reveal the truth, and the outcome was believed to be determined by divine will. If the accused emerged unscathed, it was seen as a sign of divine favor. If they were injured, it was interpreted as a sign of their guilt. Despite its brutal nature, the trial by ordeal was a widely accepted practice in medieval Europe. For centuries, it was seen as the most effective way of determining guilt or innocence. In a society where superstition and faith played such a central role in daily life, the idea that God would intervene to reveal the truth made sense to many. However, as time passed, the system began to show its flaws. The trials were harsh and often unfair, and many innocent people suffered because of them. The Church itself began to question the practice, recognizing that the physical suffering involved in these trials did not necessarily correlate with guilt or innocence. By the 13th century, the Church began to take a more active role in questioning the validity of trial by ordeal. Church officials began to recognize that relying on divine judgment through physical trials was not a reliable method of determining guilt. The practice of trial by ordeal slowly began to be phased out, and by the end of the Middle Ages, it had been largely replaced by more rational systems of justice. The death of the ordeal marked the beginning of a new era of legal practice, one that would be based on evidence, reason, and the idea that justice should be fair and impartial. Despite the eventual decline of trial by ordeal, the legacy of this practice still lingers in the collective memory of history. It serves as a reminder of a time when faith and superstition ruled, and where pain and suffering were seen as necessary tools of justice. The trial by ordeal was a brutal and inhumane practice, but it was also a reflection of the medieval mindset and its understanding of divine intervention and justice. The medieval world was one where faith and reason were constantly in tension, and where the line between divine will and human law was often blurred. The trial by ordeal stands as a chilling testament to this era, a time when justice was decided not by logic, but by the whims of fate and the will of God. In the medieval world, Sunday was not simply the seventh day of the week. It was a day deeply imbued with religious significance. The Sabbath was seen as a sacred period of rest, a day set aside by God for prayer, reflection, and the rejuvenation of the soul. But it also came with strict rules that governed the behavior of the faithful, particularly in relation to work. The Sunday law, or the religious mandate to abstain from labor, was an integral part of this structured day. For many, it wasn't just a matter of personal devotion, it was a law imposed with the full weight of religious and, often, civil authority. For those who lived under the watchful eye of the Church, breaking this rule could result in severe punishment, fines, mandatory confession, or even public penance. These laws were intended to ensure that Sunday was respected as a day of rest, but they also had a profound impact on the lives of ordinary people, particularly the peasants who formed the backbone of medieval society. The Sunday law was not simply a suggestion, it was a decree that had been firmly embedded in the social fabric. There was no wiggle room for those who worked in the fields, tended to livestock, or performed other necessary tasks. The law restricted their ability to work and earn a living, which in turn dictated the rhythm of their lives. In an age when survival was often a daily struggle, this law may have seemed burdensome. For peasants, Sundays were already a day to rest from their labor in the fields, but now it was officially sanctioned. And yet, it brought with it a sense of limitation. What if there was something urgent that needed attention, or a task that simply couldn't wait for another day? The Sunday law presented these dilemmas, and for those who dared to break the rule, there were harsh consequences. Yet, ironically, the very law that imposed such restrictions also gave the peasants something they rarely experienced: a day of precious stillness. The church's mandate was clear: no work could be done, no labor could be performed, and no commerce could be transacted on Sundays. It created a mandated pause, a forced rest from the endless cycle of hard work that defined their lives. For many, it was a day that could be used to catch up on rest, spend time with family, or reflect in quiet solitude. In a world where every day was filled with toil, the enforced stillness of Sunday gave people an opportunity for rest that they otherwise wouldn't have had. For the peasants, Sunday became more than just a religious observance. It was their one guaranteed day off from the demands of labor. They could take a break from the exhausting daily grind of plowing fields, mending fences, or tending to livestock. It was the one day when they could let their bodies rest and their minds wander, without the constant pressure of work or the threat of hunger looming overhead. In a time where food was scarce and the expectations for hard work were unrelenting, Sunday was a brief reprieve from the harshness of life. It wasn't that the peasants had the luxury of leisure or relaxation, but rather that the law forced a pause on their otherwise relentless lives. For the ruling class and the church, the Sunday law was seen as a means of preserving moral order and ensuring the sanctity of the Sabbath. But for the peasants, the law took on a different meaning. It was their only true day of rest, their only day to recuperate physically, mentally, and spiritually. They had little power in the medieval world, but the Sunday law gave them something that felt like a form of freedom. It was a paradox. The law that restricted their labor also gave them an essential respite. It was a reminder of the strange balance between the divine and the earthly, between the laws of God and the harsh realities of life. At the same time, however, the Sunday law also created a form of inequality. While peasants were required to observe the day of rest, the nobility had the luxury of being able to ignore the restrictions. The lords and ladies of the manor, living in their grand stone houses with well-stocked larders, had their own means of rest and comfort. They could keep their fires burning throughout the day, engage in social activities, or simply enjoy the pleasures of life. The peasants, on the other hand, had to abide by the curfew, which meant that their lives were dictated not only by their physical labor but also by the imposition of rules that were often out of their control. The inequities in the system became painfully clear, with the wealthy often able to disregard the limitations placed on the poor. In a society where every aspect of life was carefully regulated, from the food they ate to the hours they worked, the Sunday law became yet another way to maintain control and order. It was a law that forced people into submission, but it also provided an unexpected relief for those who needed it most. The peasants, who were often subjected to harsh conditions, had little in terms of personal agency. They were bound by the whims of their lords, the rules of the church, and the daily demands of survival. And yet, for one day a week, they were allowed a rare and fleeting moment of peace. Sunday, in its own way, became a symbol of the tension between power and submission, between freedom and restraint. But there was more to this story than simply a day of rest. The Sunday law wasn't just about providing a reprieve for the weary. It was about the control of time itself. Time was a precious commodity in the medieval world, and the church and the monarchy were the primary arbiters of how it should be spent. By dictating when people could work and when they had to rest, the church was exerting control over every aspect of life. The curfew, the prayers, the fasting, and the work schedules, they were all a way of imposing order on a chaotic world. And while the peasants might have found comfort in their enforced rest, it was still a reminder of who held the power in this society. For those who broke the law, there were consequences. The punishments for working on Sunday varied, from fines and public penance to more severe measures. But the law was clear. Rest was sacred, and the law of God was to be obeyed without question. In this sense, the Sunday law was a powerful tool for maintaining control, for reminding people that even their rest was not truly their own. It was regulated, monitored, and enforced by those in power. In the grand scheme of medieval life, Sunday was one of the few things that belonged to the peasants. It was their only day of true respite, and though it came with its own set of rules and restrictions, it allowed them to rest in a world that rarely gave them that privilege. It was a day that symbolized the intersection of religion, law, and power, and in many ways, it was the only time when the peasants could assert their humanity. While they were bound by the laws of the land, the Sunday law gave them a brief moment of relief, a moment to reflect, to rest, and to simply be. It was a law that, in its own peculiar way, allowed the poor to escape, if only for a day, the harsh realities of their world. And for that brief, sacred moment, they could find peace, a peace that was theirs, even if only for a fleeting time. As the medieval world staggered through its hardships, the structures that governed daily life became ironclad, ensuring that each person knew their place and their purpose. One such structure was the guild system, which defined every aspect of an artisan's life. The craft you practiced was more than just work, it was a calling. To create, to make, to build, you had to be sanctioned. Your very livelihood rested on the approval of your guild. If you wished to bake bread, forge metal, weave cloth, or produce anything of value, you had to earn your place within one of these tightly knit brotherhoods. And once you entered, there was no turning back. Guilds were designed to protect the integrity of a craft. They ensured that standards were upheld, that each product was crafted to its highest potential, and that no one was allowed to disrupt the order they had established. The work was sacred, rooted in tradition and skill passed down through generations. Yet, within this rigid framework, there was little room for the individual's personal ambition. The guilds governed not only the quality of the work, but the speed at which it was done, the methods used, and the price at which it was sold. Creativity and innovation were seen as threats to the order of things. To introduce something new was not an act of genius, but one of heresy. Guild members were expected to honor the methods of the past, and anyone who dared to stray from tradition risked being ostracized. The journey into a trade began long before one could call themselves a master. Young boys, often from humble beginnings, would begin as apprentices, bound to their masters for years of service. The apprenticeship was grueling. It was not just about learning the skills of the craft, but also about learning to obey. It was a time of hardship, where the apprentice's work was often menial sweeping floors, fetching water, or running errands, but it was essential to proving one's worth. These young apprentices were at the mercy of their masters, who could be kind, cruel, or indifferent. They worked long hours, often in silence, as the pounding of hammers, the constant stir of the loom, or the crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled their world. They were learning not just the craft, but the art of submission their lives, bound to a hierarchy that demanded obedience before excellence. After years of toil, the day would eventually come when the apprentice was allowed to become a journeyman, but it wasn't guaranteed. Even then, the journeyman could only work for a limited period before he could be elevated to master, and only after proving himself worthy by crafting something worthy of the title. Becoming a master was not just about skill. It was about gaining respect within the guild, earning the trust of fellow craftsmen, and conforming to the expectations of the system. Each step along the way was a trial, and each trial a testament to the person's worthiness to carry on the legacy of the craft. For all the rigorous training, the ultimate goal was always the same: to carry the legacy of the guild forward, to perpetuate the way things had been done for centuries. It was not about changing the world or breaking boundaries. It was about continuing the traditions set before them, ensuring that the work was done with the same level of precision, the same methods, and the same dedication that had defined the guild for generations. A new idea was seen as an affront to this sacred practice. Innovation was not a virtue but a vice, something to be feared and suppressed. Those who dared to think outside the accepted norms were seen as rebels unworthy of the privilege of the guild's protection. And yet, there were always whispers of those who defied the constraints of their trade. The guilds may have stifled ambition, but there were always a few who couldn't help but yearn for something more. They were the visionaries, the dreamers, the ones who saw the craft not as a mere act of replication but as an opportunity for creation. They dreamed of new designs, new methods, new ways to change the world, but they were outliers, often dismissed, sometimes even punished. The very guilds that were designed to protect and preserve also served to limit and control. The irony of the system was clear. It was a place for tradition and the preservation of skill, but also a place that could not tolerate the very thing that kept the world moving forward: change. In this world of structured, rigid labor, every step, every process, and every outcome was decided by the guilds. The role of craftsmanship in medieval society was one of profound meaning. It wasn't just a livelihood, it was a calling, and one that had to be earned. To be part of this world was to accept the boundaries, to submit to the hierarchy, and to work without question. Creativity was sacrificed in favor of perfection, and perfection was judged by the guild's standards, not the individual's. But even within these confines, there was room for human will. Apprentices, though bound by the rules of their masters, often found ways to inject their own desires into their work. Over time, they learned to balance the constraints of the guild with their own passions. The relationship between craftsmanship and freedom was a delicate one, a negotiation that could often lead to extraordinary innovation hidden in the shadows of the guild's rules. In this world, the guilds ruled over every aspect of a craftsman's life, providing protection but also trapping them in a cycle of tradition. The system was as much about preserving the old as it was about enforcing the rules. But in the silence of the workshops, in the soft rustling of wool or the rhythmic pounding of metal, there was always the potential for something more, something new. It just needed to find its way into the hands of someone brave enough to break free. In the medieval world, time was a concept that transcended the personal. It was shaped by the rhythm of the community. In a world where mechanical clocks were a rarity, the measurement of time came from a much more audible source: the bells. Hanging in the towers of churches and monasteries, these bells became the beating heart of every village, every town, and every city, tolling the passage of time with a clarity and regularity that nothing else could provide. The day was defined not by the ticking of hands on a clock, but by the sounds of bells ringing out across the land. From the first light of morning, when the bell rang for the matins, the early prayer that marked the dawn, to the final toll of the evening, which signaled the end of the day and the time for rest, the bells governed the lives of all who heard them. Their resonating chimes determined when the workers would rise from their beds, when to set aside their labor, and when to retreat into the comfort of their homes. The bell's call at midday signified a pause in the workday, a moment to rest and break bread. The sound was a command, a reminder that time was not theirs to control, but belonged to something far greater. It was a moment for the workers to catch their breath, to listen as their fellow villagers clattered around them in the marketplace, pausing for a quick meal before returning to their labor. The bells were there to remind them that the day was not a series of individual efforts, but part of a grander design. Each bell toll, each chime, became a signal to those who worked the fields, tended the hearths, and crafted goods. unifying them under the invisible hand of time. But the bells did more than simply divide the day. They created an atmosphere of harmony in a world otherwise full of strife and uncertainty. The tolling was not merely a reminder of the passage of hours, but a signal of obedience to a higher order. The sound of bells was a cue to settle into the rhythm of the day, an unspoken agreement between the people and the structure of the world around them. They helped to smooth over the rough edges of medieval life, creating a predictable, almost musical rhythm to the chaos of survival. Bells were not only instruments of time, they were the heartbeat of religious devotion. The ringing of the bells at specific hours was as much about spirituality as it was about scheduling. They called the faithful to prayer at fixed hours throughout the day, from the early morning prayers to vespers at sunset. They were the markers that separated the sacred from the secular, with each toll reminding everyone that there was a greater force in control, far above the mundane concerns of the everyday. It was a call to remember one's place in the world, to acknowledge the rhythm of life as something set by divine order, not by the whims of human nature. As the bells tolled, they also brought a sense of communal purpose. Whether in the cold of winter or the warmth of summer, when the bell rang, everyone heard it. It was not just a signal to work or rest, it was a signal that each individual was part of something larger. The work in the fields, the chores at home, the services at church, all these actions, though vastly different, were part of a communal rhythm orchestrated by the bells. This sense of shared time created an unspoken bond between peasants and nobles alike, a reminder that the flow of the day was not something anyone could escape, no matter their station. The tolling bells also governed social order. They marked the boundaries between work and rest, day and night, sacred and profane. To hear the bells ring for vespers, for example, was to be reminded that it was time to set aside worldly pursuits and prepare for prayer. Those who defied the bells were not merely disobedient to time, they were defying the natural order of life itself. The bells were a constant reminder that time was not their own, it was part of a greater, unchangeable rhythm. For those who heard it, the bell's sound was an act of submission to a divine law that governed the universe. It was not merely a piece of metal in the tower, it was a voice from heaven. Yet, despite the seeming harmony they created, the bells were not a universal comfort. For some, they were a reminder of the control and structure that ruled over their lives. The poor, the laborers, and the peasants, for whom life was a constant struggle, were bound to these bells in ways that were not always kind. The sound of the bells, once an aid to organizing their world, could become a reminder of their servitude to the land, to their lords, and to the divine hierarchy. For them, the tolls signified not a peaceful order, but the inescapable grip of a world that never allowed them to forget their place. In this world without clocks, the bells governed time in a way that was deeply personal, yet universally felt. There was no escape from their sound, no way to ignore the commands they issued. Even the nobles, for all their wealth and privilege, could not escape the inevitable marking of time. The bells rang for them too. And while they may have enjoyed the luxury of private estates with their own fires burning through the long night, they, too, were tied to the rhythm set by the bells. The clanging toll was not just a reminder of the day's passing, but of the unyielding passage of time that no one could control. The bells were the soundtrack of life, an inescapable, constant presence in the medieval world. And though the sound of their tolling filled the air, it was never a call for rebellion. It was a call for unity, a call to return to one's duties, to find solace in the fact that time, no matter how cruel, was also a shared experience. It was a sound that, no matter how loud or soft, reminded each person that they were part of something greater, even if that something was the ever-present rhythm of life dictated by the bells themselves. The medieval world, with its complex web of superstition and practicality, often turned to what we might call common sense in our modern world, but their sense was, as you might expect, quite different. It was a time when the line between hygiene and sin blurred, where cleanliness wasn't just a matter of health, but of faith, morality, and even divine favor. This was never more true than with the rise and fall of the public bathhouses. Once considered important social hubs in medieval towns, bathhouses were more than places of cleanliness. They were the gathering spots for much of the social life in the city. The sounds of laughter, conversations, and clinking coins echoed from the tiled walls as people gathered to scrub away the grime of everyday life. People went to these bathhouses not only to clean themselves, but also to relax, socialize, and, in many cases, to escape the monotony of their daily struggles. For the poor, they were perhaps the only opportunity for any kind of luxury. But for all their perceived benefits, bathhouses carried a dark side. They were the breeding grounds of disease. When plague and syphilis made their rounds across Europe, these seemingly harmless places of hygiene were quickly blamed for the spread of the infections. Bathhouses, already filled with the scent of sweat, steam, and soap, now reeked of suspicion and superstition. The link between communal bathing and the spread of disease led to the eventual closing of these public spaces. The church, with its overwhelming influence over medieval society, began to equate bathing with sinful indulgence and immorality. It wasn't long before bathing itself was viewed with distrust. What was once seen as a natural and essential part of human life, the act of bathing began to be regarded as an act of moral defiance. The church, in its attempt to keep order and maintain the strict social codes of the time, began to promote the idea that washing one's body too thoroughly was a gateway to lewdness, excess, and ultimately, heresy. The concept of purity became so tied to spiritual cleanliness that the act of cleansing the body was seen as a threat to the soul. Dirt, it seemed, became a symbol of virtue. A strange paradox unfolded. Dirt and filth were seen as the marks of piety, as if the dirtier you were, the more you were aligned with God's will. To be unclean was to be humble, modest, and obedient. To cleanse oneself was to indulge in sinful excess. The very idea of a bathhouse, a place where people could cleanse themselves and their bodies, was now synonymous with the destruction of one's moral integrity. The shift was dramatic. What had once been an ordinary practice of personal hygiene became associated with temptation, pleasure, and, in some cases, even the devil's influence. For those in the lower classes, who had once relied on public baths as a necessary part of life, their exclusion from this simple luxury became another tool of social control. The wealthy could still afford private baths in their opulent castles, but for the masses, bathing in public was now a forbidden indulgence. Bathhouses became outcasts, and so did their patrons. As the idea of cleanliness evolved, so too did the importance placed on being unspoiled by the pleasures of the world. With their closure, society began to prize dirt, grimminess, and abstinence as marks of divine favor. Personal hygiene became another measure by which one's piety could be gauged. Public bathing was now considered a sinful act that separated the faithful from the morally pure. Yet, this transformation had long-lasting effects. For the common people, it meant a return to dirtier habits, more limited access to basic sanitation, and the resurgence of illnesses that could have been prevented. It also reinforced the idea that to be clean was a luxury reserved for the few, an ideal kept within the upper echelons of society. Even as the centuries passed, the ripple effects of this shift could still be seen in later eras, where social status continued to be equated with cleanliness, and the act of washing one's body was viewed with both fascination and judgment. In the end, the public bathhouses became symbols not of cleanliness, but of the social divisions of medieval Europe. They were a reflection of a time when the body, hygiene, and morality were intertwined in the most peculiar of ways. And even as the medieval world grew more rigid, more ordered, and more obsessed with appearances, the fundamental act of keeping oneself clean remained, ironically, a source of controversy. What had once been a necessary part of human life had now become an act of rebellion, and from this, society learned a strange and enduring lesson. Sometimes, in a world obsessed with piety and purification, the most rebellious act you can commit is simply to wash away the dirt of the world. During the medieval period, food was more than just nourishment. It was a signifier of one's place in the rigid social hierarchy that dominated every aspect of life. In the grand tapestry of feudal society, where power was concentrated in the hands of the few, food became a marker, a subtle but clear indication of status. At the highest levels of society, the rich dined on sumptuous feasts that were the stuff of legend, their tables laden with white bread, roasted meats, exotic spices, and a variety of dishes that even today would evoke awe. For the poor, however, the story was vastly different. Their meals were simple and monotonous, made up of barley loaves, cabbage, and thin stews just enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. The divide between the food of the rich and the poor was not just a matter of taste, but of politics. It was no mere coincidence that the most luxurious foods were reserved for the wealthy. It was part of an unspoken law of social control. The rich ate in abundance, their tables overflowing with the finest foods that money could buy. The noble classes had access to meat that was roasted, grilled, or boiled to perfection, garnished with spices imported from far-flung parts of the world. The rich enjoyed the tender cuts of lamb, beef, and venison, with a variety of sauces that would send the senses into a frenzy. Exotic spices such as saffron, cinnamon, and pepper, which were considered luxuries, were sprinkled liberally on these dishes, elevating their meals into a grand spectacle. Their feasts were not merely meals but performances, elaborate displays of wealth, power, and indulgence. Meanwhile, the poor were left with much less. Their meals consisted primarily of barley loaves, a cheap, dense bread that filled the stomach but provided little in terms of nourishment or flavor. Cabbage, a hardy vegetable that could be grown easily in small plots, was a common staple, often served in a thin broth, sometimes with a bit of meat thrown in for flavor. Though this was rare, their diet was based on necessity rather than luxury, designed solely to keep them alive rather than to indulge their senses. When meat was included, it was usually salted fish or the tougher, less desirable cuts of animals that the rich had no interest in. Meals for the poor were often bland, repetitive, and uninspiring, lacking the variety and richness that the nobles enjoyed. But the most striking feature of this disparity in food was the strict enforcement of class divisions through what people ate. Eating above one's station, or attempting to mimic the eating habits of the wealthy, was not just frowned upon, it was a serious offense. If a peasant were caught eating meat that wasn't deemed appropriate for their station, or if they were found indulging in a luxury that was reserved for the nobility, they could face severe punishment. This could range from fines, public humiliation, or even imprisonment. The very act of consuming food beyond one's prescribed role in society was seen as an attempt to overstep one's bounds, a challenge to the established social order. It was a way for the ruling class to maintain the status quo. The rich dined on rich foods, and the poor were forced to eat what they were given. Food, in this context, was not just about survival or pleasure. It was about control. The social order was enforced not just through laws and policies, but also through the very food people consumed. The rich were allowed the luxury of eating well, while the poor were kept in their place through the scarcity of food and the limits placed on what they could access. It was a form of control that went beyond material wealth and seeped into every aspect of daily life, from the clothes they wore to the food they ate. In a society where everything was dictated by class, even the act of eating became a symbol of subjugation. The idea that hunger was a fate, a natural part of life for the poor, was not just a consequence of poverty, it was a deliberate policy. The wealthy maintained their position by ensuring that the poor remained dependent, unable to rise above their station. Hunger was something that kept the lower classes in check, a constant reminder of their place in society. The aristocracy ate lavishly not only because they could afford it, but also because they understood the power of excess. By indulging in the finest foods, they reinforced their superiority, creating a stark contrast between themselves and the masses who could only dream of such luxuries. The disparity between the rich and poor, at its core, was maintained by the inequality in food consumption. The nobility's banquets were a display of everything the lower classes could never have: abundance, luxury, and indulgence. The feasts were an essential part of the medieval court's pageantry, a way for the rich to demonstrate their wealth, while the poor could only watch in envy as the nobles dined. But it was not just about food. It was about maintaining a system that kept the poor in a state of need and dependence. The ruling class knew that as long as the poor were hungry, they would remain subjugated, unable to challenge the existing power structures. For the peasants, food was survival, but for the rich, it was more than that. It was a sign of their status, their power, and their control over the world around them. It was a way to create a distinction between those who could afford to feast and those who could barely scrape by. The ruling class used food not just to nourish their bodies, but to assert their dominance, making it clear that there was a fundamental difference between them and the poor. The poor, in turn, were made to feel the weight of that difference in their daily lives, as they struggled to make do with what little they had. It was not just a matter of food, it was about control, about keeping the classes in their place and ensuring that the social hierarchy remained intact. In the end, food was much more than sustenance in the medieval world. It was a symbol of power, a tool for maintaining the social order, and a reminder of the vast divide between the classes. The rich ate well, and the poor ate what they could, and this division was enforced not just by law, but by the very food they consumed. The luxury of a full plate was not available to all. It was reserved for those who had the power and wealth to enjoy it. And for the poor, their hunger was not just a consequence of poverty. It was a deliberate policy that ensured they remained in their place, always beneath the privileged elite. In the grand tapestry of medieval life, food was as much about survival as it was about submission. The rich dined on excess, while the poor barely survived. And this disparity, in many ways, defined the world they lived in. The world of the medieval period was one of rigid divisions, not just in life, but in death as well. In a time when everything was governed by strict laws of class, the hierarchy did not end at the grave. Death, a natural process that should have leveled all, was instead another arena where one's place in the social order was reinforced. This division was starkly clear in how the dead were treated and where they were allowed to rest. For the wealthy, death was just another opportunity to display their high status. The grandiosity of their tombs was nothing short of spectacular, and their resting places were often within the walls of grand churches. The nobility of the time believed that their eternal resting places should reflect their lives, and so their tombs were often elaborately designed with intricate carvings, marble statues, and golden inscriptions. These tombs were not merely a place to lay their bodies to rest, but were rather monumental statements of their importance in the afterlife. For them, being buried in a place of sanctity like a church was the ultimate testament to their status and their relationship with God. These tombs were often placed in prominent areas within the church, sometimes even near the altar, where the light would shine upon them for all to see, reinforcing their importance and their eternal legacy. The church itself, the center of religious life during the medieval period, also played a key role in determining where people would be buried. The church's power extended beyond the living and into the realm of death, dictating not only the spiritual salvation of individuals, but also their physical placement in the afterlife. For the wealthy, this meant being buried in consecrated ground within church walls, where the faithful believed the souls of the departed could continue their connection with God. This connection was sealed, quite literally, in marble, and their tombs were meant to outlast the ravages of time and decay, preserving their status as spiritual and social exemplars. They were remembered for their piety, their power, and their wealth, even in death. In contrast, the poor were not afforded the same dignity in death. They were cast aside and treated with the same disregard that society had shown them in life. The poor, often ignored and overlooked, were denied the same sanctified rest that the rich had in life. Instead, they were typically relegated to mass graves, places where their bodies would be dumped, unmarked and unremembered. In the eyes of the medieval world, their bodies were not worthy of the same reverence. The poor had no grand tombstones, no marble markers with their names carved in stone. Instead, their final resting places were anonymous pits, often in the most unremarkable of places. Their death, like their life, was seen as insignificant, a simple passage that left little trace upon the world. The concept of the final resting place in the medieval period was intrinsically tied to one's status. For the poor, death was not just the end of life, but the continuation of their oppression. Mass graves were often located on the outskirts of towns or in forgotten corners of churchyards. These areas, considered unworthy of the rich, became the final destination for those whose lives were deemed unimportant. This practice reinforced the social hierarchy even after death, ensuring that the poor were left in the shadows of society, even in their final moments. But the disparity didn't end with the poor. There was another group who were also denied a proper burial: criminals and suicides. To be a criminal, or to take one's own life, was seen as a sin not only in the eyes of society but also by the church. The idea of purity was central to medieval Christian doctrine, and anyone who violated these sacred principles was seen as tainted. A criminal soul was thought to be forever damned, and they were often denied the comfort of a Christian burial. Their bodies, instead of being placed in consecrated ground, were thrown into unholy earth, unmarked and unblessed. This practice was seen as a final punishment, further denying these individuals any shred of dignity. The bodies of criminals and suicides were discarded in a manner that reflected their perceived moral failures in life. This division extended even further. In many cases, if a person died by suicide, their body was treated with even greater contempt. Not only were they denied a proper burial, but their body was often disposed of in a way that signified their rejection by society and God. They were buried in unmarked graves, sometimes in common pits, often with no religious rites performed over their bodies. The church viewed suicide as the ultimate betrayal of the divine order, and as a result, those who took their own lives were seen as doubly cursed. Their punishment, in the eyes of medieval society, didn't end with their death. It continued beyond the grave. It is this contrast between the rich and the poor, between the good and the bad in society, that highlights the deeply ingrained inequalities of the medieval period. Death, just as much as life, was governed by class. The rich were afforded the opportunity to rest in peace in ornate, beautiful tombs, while the poor were cast aside to rot in mass graves, their souls and bodies neglected. Even in death, their worth was determined by the wealth they had accumulated during their lives. Those who had lived virtuous lives in the eyes of society were given the comfort of being buried in consecrated ground, while the rest were forgotten. And yet, it was not just those who were poor or immoral who suffered in death. Those who committed suicide were also forced to bear the burden of their actions even after their passing. Death, in the medieval world, was not just an end, but a continuation of the social divisions that defined the lives of so many. The very way one was buried and the place where their body was laid to rest spoke volumes about the life they had lived and the role they had played in society. The rich were given grand tombs, symbols of their elevated status, while the poor were left to rot in mass graves, their bodies lost to time. Even those who were considered immoral or who had taken their own lives were denied dignity in death, their bodies discarded in the same way society had discarded them in life. Death in the medieval period was just another form of social control, ensuring that those who were deemed unworthy were forgotten, while the wealthy and powerful continued to be celebrated and remembered. As we look back on these practices, we see how deeply ingrained the inequalities of the medieval world were. The hierarchical structures that existed in life were continued in death, and the concept of fairness, justice, and equality was largely absent. The rich were able to ensure that their legacy would live on forever in grand tombs and elaborate monuments, while the poor, criminals, and suicides were consigned to the forgotten corners of history. This stark division between the rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless, was a reflection of the society that created it, and it continued long after the final breath was taken. Even in death, the medieval world ensured that the privileged remained on top and the oppressed remained below. Today, as we look back on these practices, we see the deep social and moral injustices that were baked into the fabric of medieval society. The divisions of class, the treatment of criminals and suicides, and the exclusion of the poor from even the simplest of honors in death are reminders of how history has shaped our understanding of fairness and justice. The stories of these forgotten people, those who lived in the shadows of society and were denied dignity in both life and death, are still relevant today. Their struggles, their suffering, and their treatment in life and death serve as a reminder that even in the face of death, inequality can persist, and the powerful can continue to hold dominion over the powerless. The medieval world, as cruel as it may seem in hindsight, laid the groundwork for many of the inequalities and injustices that we still grapple with today. Versailles, with its golden halls and grandiose walls, is a monument to excess, but it also stands as a paradox, a shining beacon of opulence, shrouded in a fog of filth and superstition. The rules and customs that governed life within its walls were not just for show or convenience. They were crafted from necessity, born of a time when survival was as much about control as it was about faith. Each bizarre decree, from the curfew bell to the strange dietary laws, was a response to the world around it, where disorder, disease, and death lurked just beyond the veneer of civilization. These strange laws were never truly stupid. Instead, they were strategies devised to keep the chaos at bay, to carve some semblance of order out of the dark unknown. They were ways to cope with a world in which uncertainty ruled, and so the church, the state, and the nobility created their own language of law, one that intertwined faith with control, superstition with protection. In a time where science was still in its infancy, these laws were an attempt to impose some sense of security on an unpredictable world. When medical knowledge was limited and superstition thrived, rules like the prohibition of meat or the restrictions on bathing seemed to hold the power of life and death. While these laws may seem outlandish to us today, they were based on the fears of a people who had no other means of understanding or controlling the forces around them. They sought comfort in rituals, in practices that could make the world feel less chaotic, even if that meant embracing the absurd. Every rule, every decree, no matter how strange it may appear, was an attempt to make the chaos of life manageable. They were attempts at protecting the people from the invisible, uncontrollable forces that lurked within the world: disease, death, poverty, and the ever-present fear of divine retribution. In that context, each bizarre restriction was more than just a law. It was a protective measure, a way of carving out a space where people could cling to the illusion of control, even if just for a while. And so, the Middle Ages unfolded in a way that we might struggle to understand. The rules were strange, the laws sometimes nonsensical, but they were grounded in the fears of the time. As we look back from our modern vantage point, it's easy to dismiss them as foolish or backward. But perhaps, in their way, they were just an attempt at survival, an attempt to make sense of a world that was far more frightening and unpredictable than we can imagine. The Middle Ages, with all its strange customs and contradictory rules, may have passed, but their echo lingers. The laws, the superstitions, the careful order that governed people's lives, these elements have woven their way into the fabric of history and, in some ways, into our own lives as well. While we no longer have curfew bells ringing at dusk or dietary restrictions based on religious decree, the need for control, order, and security remains with us. Perhaps, in the end, these laws were not just relics of a long-forgotten past, but echoes of the ways we still navigate the complexities of our world today. As you lie back, closing your eyes and letting the rhythms of the world fade into quiet stillness, think about those bells, those rules, those whispered prayers. Remember, once, even the smallest act of living was an act of obedience. Perhaps, just for tonight, you can think of the medieval world not as a time lost to history, but as a place where survival and faith were tied together in a delicate, fragile dance, a dance that shaped the world we now live in. If you enjoyed this journey through the past, through the strange and fascinating world of medieval life, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and join me again for another quiet exploration of history. Together, we can continue to wander through the quiet chaos of the past, where history sleeps and whispers softly in the dark.